Hello, hello, this is JT. I did this video before, but I wanted to explain some things that I learned in history, and they contradict a lot of things that we've learned, you know, yeah, because they're actually a combination of scripture and history, which gives us a clear understanding of what the history is, minus the education that we got coming up because I had to go and I had to really study history. And when I go to a history class, one of the main things that the professor says is, in order to get the most out of this class, you have to leave your cultural baggage at the door because it's going to get in the way of what you see or what you understand. Because a lot of the stuff that we have in this culture today did not exist at this time, and if we see it through that lens, it's going to cause us to have an erroneous conclusion of what the history is telling us. So you leave a cultural baggage and all your dogma at the door, and let's just study history for what it says. Okay. Okay. So there's a rabbi. His name is Jonathan Kahn. He did a series of videos, like he on the on something that God gave him as part of his assignment to release, and it was called the Nine Harbingers. And this guy, he's really up in his age, and he said that he first got saved and received Jesus as Lord and Savior when he was 16. So he had a lot of years in the faith. So he's well seasoned and well experienced in spiritual matters. So he got, to write this book called The Nine Harbingers. And I remember specifically in the video he talked about the sixth harbinger. The sixth harbinger, where it says that, when the colonists had won the Revolutionary War back in, let's say, 1783. And then they had the Constitutional Continental Convention in order to get together to govern, to come up with a type of government that would determine how they would govern the land. And in 1791, this Constitution was ratified, Constitution of the United States. And what he did was George Washington dedicated the nation to God and determined what would happen in the day that we turned away from God, that God's favor would begin to lift. And what I've done was, when I've started studying too, and I started seeing videos, I started seeing people reveal that what used to be in the history books, what used to be in class, was taught stories about General George Washington when he was like 23 years old, you know, and had the favor of God on him all the way through, because there was a French marksman that shot him many times. And when he knew that nothing could happen to him, he knew that God's hand was on him. He knew that God's favor was on him. And so, right before he died, he wanted to see who was called the bulletproof president. And he said, "Sir, I shot you 17 times. My men shot you." And eventually I just told him to stop wasting their bullets. And before I died, I wanted to meet the man that the heavenly presence was protecting. See, and that used to be in the history books until it was taken out because it was considered politically incorrect. And basically it's showing us that was evidence that, God's hand was on him. And that's what I would hear all the time when people are speaking to me. People are speaking to me through, God's talking to them through me. And then I was hear this all the time, that God's hand is on you. So I've experienced that. I know how real it is. So it makes sense that, if God raised him up to, do what he did, that he would dedicate the nation to God and declare what would happen when God's favor would lift. What would happen when they begin to turn away from God? His favor would lift. Well, it took me some time to discover that went deeper than just a covenant that he made with God, then sealed by the contract, which was the United States. That also involved all the people who were on that land at that time. And on the land at that time in 1791, during that covenant, because we're all involved in that covenant, you had the abolitionists of the North. The colonists that came over from Europe of the north, of the north. And in the south, you had the enslavers and you had the slaves. We were all on, our ancestors were all on the continent, or the country at that time. So that covenant involved all of us that were here. So we see that somewhere this is what's happening now. People have forgotten about that or never knew about it. And one of the spiritual laws says that a house divided falls and a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. That doesn't mean if the land cracks in half, one half of it stands and the other half falls. That means both half falls. So we're kind of like country brothers and sisters. And one of the biggest, like the only way that they could bring this, that land together, the North and the South, as a complete union for the United States, was they were separate. One of the biggest issues that they were divided on, the North and the South were divided on, was the issue of slavery. Because the North wanted to abolish slavery and the South wanted to expand it. Because the North's issue was, how can all men of the Constitution be considered and considered to be equal when some men are not? So they wanted to honor the Constitution, which was being based on the Bible, according to how George Washington had God's hand on him in order for the land to be established as a free nation. So for that reason, slavery, in their mind, had to be abolished, or at least according to it. To be right with God, slavery had to be abolished. Now, this is just the real history, regardless of what we've been taught, what we've been coming across, what we've heard, because we know that the transatlantic slave trade officially began in 1620, but it was happening long before then, like 300 years before it became legal. But they didn't start bringing the slaves over here until 1700, because before then they were using European labor, getting indentured servants from over to Europe to do all the labor, and they were doing the Africans at the same time, but they were mainly focusing on them. But once they, invented this thing called the white race, they stopped focusing on the European labor and started focusing more on the African labor around 1700. So, this is the real history. And when we all came together, and fought for freedom, because the only reason that the slaves were able to walk off the plantation on June 19th, because we celebrate June 19th, and I did a video saying that we need to give the dedication and the thanks and the credit to God, because it was only through him that June 19th was possible. People didn't walk off the plantation because they got tired of being slaves. They walked off the plantation because it was no longer legal to keep them there. It was no longer legal. Slavery had become illegal, and the only way that slavery was illegal, you had the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an announcement, but due to be followed up by the legal documents. What was the legal documents? The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment broke the chains. 14th Amendment gave us citizenship. 15th Amendment gave the right to vote. That was the only reason that they were able to walk off the plantation and have the chains broken off of them. But something else happened, at some time, like within 10, 15 years, the Constitution began to change. So now the new Constitution of 1871 is no longer the same Constitution of 1791 that was made in agreement with God by George Washington. The language changed. It went from life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which was about land, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh yeah, we went to explain the great divide, why they were divided on slavery and what had to happen. Because, they ended up coming to this 3/5 compromise. Because, okay, the compromise was this. In Washington, you had representation that states got depended on how many people lived in that state. So the slaves down south, the slave owners, they wanted to count each of the slaves as full members of the state. so that they would have more representation in Congress. But they didn't want to give any representation to the slaves, while the ones in the North didn't want them to be able to count the slaves at all, since they didn't consider them to be citizens, just property. But in order to make this union come together as one union, they had to have a compromise. And the compromise where they would be able to count only 3 out of 5 slaves for the purposes of representation in Washington, D.C. This is known as the Three-Fifth Compromise. And a lot of people have come to believe that this had something to do with the value of the worth of an individual, and it doesn't. You know, matter of fact, there were many times that, blacks in the North went and sued. Even the Dred Scott decision that led to the Civil War. He had sued for something, and he won his case locally, but when they took it to Supreme Court, they overturned it because they said on the basis that they were not considered to be citizens, they were considered to be property. Now, if that was the result of that case, the lawyer or anybody could have advised him that he could have asked for 3/5 of his stuff if that was what the law said. And if he had asked for it, they would have laughed him out of the courtroom. They would say, you clearly don't understand what that law means. There is nowhere in any history or any law book where any of the blacks asked for 3/5 of their stuff, because that's not what it means. People have misunderstood that for years. Okay, so so that explained that, in order to form a union, they had to come together as one nation, and this would complete the revelation where the nation would come together as one nation of light and dark. Where the nation has the beast has 2 horns like a lamb, yet speaks as a dragon. That's a combination of light and dark in one nation. That was a prediction in Revelations. The beast represents a nation, and says that eventually she will begin to speak as a dragon. Now, when a nation speaks through its laws, through its legislation. And the first time that nation began to speak as a dragon was when the Constitution was changed. That means at that point, it began to fall into other hands, probably into the same hands that they took it from. And they began to make war on the citizens, both the former slaves and the colonists of the North who fought for freedom. So we began to get really educated, and we began to come up and learn different stuff. And all the stuff that we learned, and that it's caused us to come to the point where we are. And we see that everything is breaking down, nations falling apart. And of course, if we are all basically the children of the Most High, because we're here on this nation that was established for believers, because it's based on the Constitution, which is based on the law of God. So, I got like a minute left, so let me wrap this up. So, a lot of people say that the slaves are really the Jews of the Bible. I'm not going to, elaborate whether they are or not, but you also have the other ones, the European descendants, which, if we look back, this is actually Greece, spiritual Greece, because a lot of them came out of a slavery that was prophesied for them to be in. And actually, if you go back, you check Revelation 12, where it says that the dragon made war with the remnant of his seed, because once he went after Israel, he couldn't get to her and she was protected. So he made war against the remnant of her seed, those who kept the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. These are those descendants. So we got the children of God, natural proselytes, if we look at it that way, on a land called by the name of God, that don't realize that they are spiritually brothers and sisters. When you see through the eyes of faith, you don't see skin color. God never called anybody by skin color. So this is just a warning that if these two are fighting against each other, the whole thing will fall. And of course, it says when you lead into captivity, you yourself will go into captivity. And that's a spiritual law, and I've seen it come through many, many times. So it's a warning. It's JT.